Good evening and welcome. I'm Susan Galassi, Senior Curator at the Frick Collection, and I'd like to welcome all of you here tonight, as well as our online viewers at frick.org/live to this wonderful event. This evening, we welcome back a very beloved former colleague, Jeongho Park, to celebrate his exhibition, Men in Armour, Greco and Pulzone Face to Face. The show was organized in connection with the El Greco year, which marks the 400th anniversary of the artist's death in Toledo, Spain. Born in Crete, where he received his early training, Domenikos Theotokopoulos, later dubbed El Greco, became one of the most illustrious artists of Spain's golden age. Mr. Park will speak tonight about El Greco's formative period in Italy, which is the subject of his exhibition. Though made up of only 2 works, the stimulating visual encounter and accompanying catalog have earned rave reviews in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. And recently, the New Yorker dubbed it one of the finest shows of the year. Jeongho Park joined the staff of the Frick Collection 2 years ago as an Anne Poulet Curatorial Fellow. During his tenure, he continued his work on his doctoral dissertation on El Greco's portraiture with Professor Jonathan Brown at the Institute of Fine Arts at NYU, while carrying out research for his exhibition. This past year, he delivered lectures in connection with the El Greco year at the Courtauld Institute, the National Gallery in Washington, the Thyssen-Bornemisza in Madrid, and the Louvre, to name only a few. Before coming to the Frick, Mr. Park held the Theodore Rousseau Traveling Fellowship from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and he worked in the curatorial department of the Seoul National Museum. He's contributed a chapter to the research companion to El Greco, published by Ashgate Press, and he's carried out several translations of books to and from Korean. A specialist in Italian and Spanish Baroque painting, Mr. Park began a new job just a few weeks ago as curatorial research associate at the Blanton Museum of Art at the University of Texas in Austin. After the lecture, the exhibition will remain open for a half hour, and everyone is invited to view the show and to meet the speaker. Please join me now in welcoming back a very good friend of the Frick, Jeongho Park.
Thank you, Susan, for this great introduction. Before I begin, I wish to express my heartfelt thanks to Ian Wardropper, Xavier Solomon, Colin Bailey, and Susan Galassi for their generous support for my exhibition project here at the Frick. Many thanks also to Rika Burnham and Adrian Lee for organizing this lecture. Arrayed in resplendent armor, with feet firmly planted and arms akimbo, El Greco's Vincenzo Anastagi directs his powerful gaze toward the viewer. He poses in an almost empty room with a single window with wooden shutters and drapery forming an oval around his upper body. Much of the force of the painting emanates from his dazzling armor. Rich highlights applied with broad brushstrokes accentuate the steel harness, its metallic sheen contrasting with the velvety texture of the green breeches and the dark crimson curtain. Though painted when El Greco was in Rome, this painterly portrait of Vincenzo Anastagi represents a distinct departure from the elegant, polished style that dominated high society portraiture of the Eternal City in the last quarter of the 16th century. The unusual character of Vincenzo Anastagi comes into sharp relief when the painting is compared with the portrait of Jacopo Boncompagni, executed in Rome a year earlier. It was painted by Scipione Pulzone, the leading portraitist of the time. Pulzone depicts Boncompagni in 3/4 length against a dark, neutral background. As in El Greco's portrait, the sitter is dressed in half armor. The exquisite ornamental motifs of the parade armor, however, sets it apart from Anastagi's austere field armor. On Boncompagni's right, the cabasset, a type of a helmet, and the right gauntlet, also lavishly decorated with matching design, are conspicuously displayed on a table covered with red velvet. A lush blue curtain drawn to the upper right balances the composition. Boncompagni's face, as well as every detail in the painting, is depicted in a meticulous manner that stands in stark contrast to El Greco's portrayal of Anastagi. In their examinations of Vincenzo Anastagi, art historians have illuminated its Venetian style and El Greco's virtuosity, but not the specific context in which the artist was working when he executed this portrait. One exception is Harold E. Wethy, whose essay published 30 years ago touches upon the issues of patronage for El Greco in Rome and offers some information about Anastagi. Tonight's lecture aims to shed new light on El Greco's Vincenzo Anastagi to show how the painting reflects the artist's worldly and artistic ambitions in the Eternal City. For this purpose, I will examine the painting's unique characteristics in relation to Pulzone's Jacopo Boncompagni and other military portraits of the time. I will also explore what it would have meant for Henry Clay Frick to acquire this portrait for his outstanding collection of paintings in the early 20th century. El Greco was born Domenikos Theotokopoulos on the island of Crete in Greece, which had been under Venetian rule since 1212. Details of his early years are not well documented, but one of the few surviving records indicates that he was already an established painter of icons by 1566. He was probably not satisfied with his career as a Byzantine icon painter because he relocated to Venice in 1567. There, he absorbed Venetian Renaissance painting and began his transformation into an Italianate painter. 3 years later, he moved to Rome in search of greater opportunities. El Greco's activities in the Eternal City are not very well recorded. The few surviving documents, however, show that the painter's major strength was in painting portraits, and that he was granted lodging in the palace of Cardinal Alessandro Farnese in 1570. El Greco's portrait of Giulio Clovio, painted during this period, exemplifies his mastery of the genre. El Greco worked for the Circle of the Cardinal for about 1.5 years before being dismissed for unknown reasons in 1572. After he fell out of Cardinal Farnese's favor, he had to find other ways to earn a living in the city. While searching for opportunities to secure patronage, he enrolled in the Compagnia di San Luca, the Painters Guild in Rome. He was required to become a member of the guild in order to work as an independent artist. Given these circumstances, it is likely that Vincenzo Anastagi represents an effort to draw the attention of powerful men. The identity of the sitter in the work is known by an inscription on a pedestal that is no longer visible. During the treatment of the work in 1958 to 59, it was covered up as it was believed to be a later addition by another hand in the 16th century. Nonetheless, the near contemporary dating of the inscription suggests that the identity of the sitter is secure. Born to a noble family in Perugia around 1531, Vincenzo Anastagi became a Knight of Malta in 1563. He was most famous for his contribution to the victory against the Ottoman Turks during the Siege of Malta in 1565. He was also known as an expert in fortifications, and his life was included in the biographies of famous people from Perugia. According to archival records, Anastagi was away from the island of Malta from 1571 to 79, when he seems to have spent some time in Rome to recruit new soldiers from Italy. As a middle-ranking nobleman, Anastagi would not have appeared to be a promising patron. Moreover, he was not particularly interested in paintings and therefore would have been unlikely to commission further works. Anastagi was, however, connected to a very eminent personage, Jacopo Boncompagni. He was the natural son of Pope Gregory XIII. Born in Bologna in 1548 to Ugo Boncompagni and his mistress Maddalena Fulchini, Jacopo was legitimized by his father almost immediately. He moved to Rome in March 1572 when his father was elected pope, and in that year he assumed the offices of governor of the Castel Sant'Angelo and commander of the Pontifical Armed Forces. In May 1575, Jacopo Boncompagni named Vincenzo Anastagi the sergeant major of the Castel Sant'Angelo. The close connection between the two men may well have motivated El Greco to paint the portrait of Anastagi. It could be expected that El Greco's portrait would be shown to Boncompagni and possibly even to the Pope and the cultural elite of Rome. Furthermore, Boncompagni had been known to be a great patron of the arts. He supported the poet Torquato Tasso, the philosopher Francesco Patrizzi, and the composer Pierluigi da Palestrina. Leading architects of the time also received Boncompagni's encouragement. Andrea Palladio and Jacopo Vignola dedicated their literary works to him. Seen in this light, the portrait of Anastagi was an ideal means of self-promotion. For his portrayal of Anastagi, El Greco would have looked to examples of military portraits not only from Venice, but also from Rome and central Italy. The most recent successful likeness of this type available to El Greco most likely was Scipione Puzzone's portrait of Jacopo Boncompagni. The three-quarter length portrait communicates the young sitter's high status by the detailed depiction of the opulent armor, the carefully groomed face, and the elegant hands. According to the inscription on the folded piece of paper in the sitter's right hand, the portrait was executed in 1574, only about 1 year before El Greco painted Vincenzo Anastagi. The paper also includes the title and name of Boncompagni, along with Puzzone's signature. In his left hand, Boncompagni holds a wooden letter case, which suggests that it was probably commissioned when Jacopo was on a diplomatic mission to Ferrara to greet Henri de Valois, the future French King Henry III. It would have been almost impossible for El Greco to be unaware of this splendid likeness of Boncompagni. The portrait of Jacopo Boncompagni is indebted to the Renaissance tradition of military portraits. The three-quarter length portrait of a sitter in armor was a Venetian trend established by Titian's portrait of Charles V, painted in Bologna in 1530, when the sitter was crowned as Holy Roman Emperor. Titian's subsequent military portraits, such as the portrait of Alfonso d'Avalos and Vincenzo Capello, follow the popular prototype. This tradition continued into the 1570s, as can be seen in Tintoretto's Sebastiano Venier and Veronese's Agostino Barbarigo. Puzzone's work follows suit. On the other hand, the polished verisimilitude of the details in his portrait reflects the international style of portraiture heralded by the Flemish painter Antonis Mor, whose work was favored by European nobility, especially the Spanish Habsburgs. It has been suggested, however, that the portrait owes a special debt to the likenesses of two illustrious Roman subjects, Bronzino's Stefano Colonna and Girolamo Cicciolante's Francesco Colonna. Pulzone certainly had access to these paintings when he was in the service of the Colonna household from 1569 to 71. Pulzone's portrait appears to have been the model for several closely related works, a testament to its popularity. For example, there is a record of a bust-length copy of the portrait that was once in the collection of a dealer in Paris. There are also several variations on the original painting. The portrait of Alessandro Farnese, Duke of Parma, in Armour, employs the same composition and details, except for the sitter's face and the insignia of the Order of the Golden Fleece on his chest. Painted by an anonymous painter in the late 16th century, Alfonso d'Este, Duke of Ferrara, is an intriguing example that also demonstrates the influence of the pictorial formula used by Pulzone. The sitter is represented in armor, standing against a neutral background. His right hand rests on the helmet placed on a table beside him. The angle of the face and the body also coincides with that in Pulzone's painting. The popularity of Pulzone's portrait derives from a lifelikeness achieved through painstakingly rendered details. Throughout the work, traces of brushwork are suppressed in order to gain a highly finished surface that adds to the sense of refinement. Complementing Boncompagni's elegant face and hands is luxurious armor that combines techniques of embossing, damascening, bluing, and gilding. The breeches, woven with gold and silver threads, display an equal degree of precision. Although lost, Boncompagni's armor has been related to that made by a Milanese armorer known as Piccinino. The cuirass from a set of parade armor produced circa 1575 shows a comparable type. The overall form of the breastplate, as well as the design of the decorative bands filled with figures and grotesque motifs, demonstrates the similarity between the Milanese armor and the armor in Pulzone's portrait. Resemblance to the Milanese breastplate is not the only element that gives the viewer an idea of how closely the painter transcribed its details. The gleam of light bouncing off the gorget, the cabasset, and the right pauldron and the vambrance lends tactile effect to the polished surface of the metal protective device. Pulzone's obsessive faithfulness to detail is most evident in the depiction of the detachable part of the right pauldron. The artist takes utmost care to describe the little turning pins that allow the semi-oval shaped plate at the bottom to be removed. The play of light in the minutest details, such as the hanging threads on the fringe of the curtain, enhances the trompe-l'oeil effect. The painter took pride in his dexterity in producing a compelling illusion. On closer examination, one finds that the sitter is in fact depicted on a fictive canvas whose edge is partially covered by the blue drape. With this pictorial device, Pulzone encourages the viewer to compare his skills to those of the ancient painter Parrhasius. According to Pliny the Elder, Parrhasius deceived his rival Zeuxis with a painting of a curtain that the latter attempted to draw to one side, not knowing that it was a painted representation. The high esteem that Pulzone enjoyed as the most sought-after painter in Rome would have also stimulated El Greco's ambitions. Moreover, El Greco would have known Pulzone personally through the Compagnia di San Luca, where the latter served as consul and overseer of the accounts. A contemporary of El Greco's, Scipione Pulzone was born in Gaeta between 1540 and 42. In Rome, he had the opportunity to execute portraits and religious paintings commissioned by patrician families. Among the sitters whom he portrayed were dignitaries of the highest rank, such as Pope Pius V, Pope Gregory XIII, Cardinal Antoine Perrenot de Granvelle, and Cardinal Alessandro Farnese. The correspondence between Hortensio Chiriac and William V, Duke of Bavaria, offers a glimpse into Pulzone's fame. In a letter of 1576, Chiriac reports that he had contacted the most famous portrait painter, Scipione Pulzone, to commission a series of portraits for the Duke. But in a later report, he mentions that Pulzone declined the commission because he was too busy painting works for other dignitaries such as Marcantonio Colonna, Giacomo Boncompagni, and Cardinal Ferdinando de' Medici. Pulzone's contemporary Raffaello Borghini also testifies to the artist's portrait painting skills and popularity. And I quote, "Scipione Pulzone is so excellent in making portraits from life that they seem alive. Hence, it was required of him to portray all the important gentlemen of Rome and all the beautiful ladies," end quote. That he was considered the foremost portrait painter is evident in Cardinal Granvelle's comment. In a letter of 1583, the Spanish ambassador to Rome quotes the cardinal, who was also portrayed by Pulzone in 1576, which you see up on the screen, to recommend painters to decorate El Escorial. I quote, "Granvelle praises the disegno of Geronimo Muziano, the color of Marcello Venusti, and the portrait of Scipione of Gaeta," end quote. Furthermore, the painter enjoyed personal relationships with powerful patrons. In 1574, Jacopo Boncompagni became the godfather of Pulzone's first son, Giacomo. Francesca Colonna Orsini, a member of two prominent noble families in Rome, was the godmother of the painter's son. Pulzone's portrayal of Boncompagni in such ostentatious armor reflects the sitter's important positions as governor of Castel Sant'Angelo and head of the papal forces. The figure of Saint Michael, represented in an oval frame at the top of the breastplate, symbolizes these two offices. The Castel Sant'Angelo was named after the archangel who, according to legend, appeared at the fortress and mausoleum in 590 and ended the plague in the city by sheathing his sword. Interestingly, Boncompagni's cuirass shows St. Michael slaying a serpent with his lance instead of withdrawing his weapon. It emphasizes the archangel's role as the warrior saint who protects the church, which also reflects Boncompagni's position as a military commander. To St. Michael's right, Fortitude reclines, embracing a column. Below the archangel on the breastplate, as well as on the cuirass, are two figures lifting up a crown that symbolizes victory and the regal status of the owner. Militant spirit is accentuated in the conspicuous display of the figure of Mars on the cabasset and the gauntlet placed on the table. Lining the golden bands that twine the armor are various trophies that symbolize military feats. More specific than the spoils are the representations of captive Turks. Along the center band, two kneeling prisoners are depicted with their hands tied at their backs. The figure of the Ottoman captive is repeated along the base of the cabasset, where he is shown with a more traditional trophy that consists of armor all'antica, a helmet, a shield, a lance, and a halberd. This decorative motif reflects the hostile attitude towards the Ottomans and invokes the fresh memory of the victory at the Battle of Lepanto in 1571. In addition to the martial motifs, there are symbols of wealth and prosperity. A female grotesque figure carrying a large jar filled with fruits is depicted on Boncompagni's left vambrance, and cornucopias are scattered among the mascarons and other grotesque motifs. Displaying himself in sumptuous armor with its connotations of masculine virtues, wealth, status, and antique lineage would have certainly conveyed the sitter's eminent status. When El Greco portrayed Vincenzo Anastagi, both the painter and the sitter would have had in mind the prestige attached to armor. The trappings that El Greco could use in the depiction of Anastagi, however, were limited by the sitter's rank of sergeant major. His is a field armor used in real battle, unlike Boncompagni's majestic parade armor, which was reserved for ceremonial occasions. The overall form of the cuirass, the spiral design on the left pauldron, and the shape of the burgonet indicate that Anastagi's is the infantry officer's armor produced in Italy in the 1570s, an example of which can be found at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Regardless of the degree of opulence, armor itself was perceived as a status symbol. In the late 16th century, the painter and writer Giovan Paolo Lomazzo complained in his treatise that, I quote, "Merchants and bankers who have never seen a drawn sword have themselves portrayed in armor with generals' batons in their hands," end quote. In this sense, Anastagi's desire to be depicted in armor reflected not only his wish to indicate his profession, but also to aggrandize himself. The element that reveals Anastagi's intention is the hilt of the rapier suspended from the baldric that runs across his cuirass. The hilt is both gilded and topped with a decorative pommel, which denotes his prestige and authority. El Greco's use of the full-length format exemplifies the sitter's ambition in a most direct way. Anastagi was from a noble family, but in terms of social status, he was nowhere near the kings, generals, and grandees for whom the full-length military portraits were reserved. The composition that displays the sitter's entire body not only emphasizes the monumentality of the figure's physique, but also maintains the physical and psychological distance between the sitter and the viewer. In other words, to be portrayed at full length was a grand statement in itself. At the same time, the portrait of a man in armor could also imply the sitter's deference to his superior. The armor of Bronzino Stefano Colonna is thought to reflect the sitter's desire to emulate his lord Cosimo de' Medici, who was also portrayed in armor. And Titian's portrait of Alfonso d'Avalos appears to show the Marquise's admiration of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. Thus, El Greco's Vincenzo Anastagi is a pictorial statement of the sitter's ambitions, which lie on the borderline of decorum within the social hierarchy. Representing Anastagi in armor would have offered an excellent opportunity for El Greco to display his artistry. Contrary to previous studies that assume this work is a literal transcription of reality, El Greco went beyond the faithful description of the symbolic objects, using invention in depicting his sitter. The most significant example is the drastic abbreviation of the details in Anastagi's armor. A comparison with the infantry armor demonstrates that the cuirass in El Greco's painting conspicuously lacks the ornamental bands. in accordance with the spiral decoration on the left pauldron, the breastplate should have the diagonal bands that extend from top to bottom. The bands that fan out from the earpiece on the real burgonet are absent as well. Considering the symbolic significance attached to armor, it is highly unusual not to depict it in full detail. Anastagi's garniture features instead the blaze of light reflected on the metal surface. Depiction of armor had posed a constant challenge for Renaissance painters. In his own biography in the lives of the most eminent painters, sculptors, and architects, Vasari writes of his difficulty in representing the polish of the armor when painting the portrait of Alessandro de' Medici in 1534. Consulted by the young Vasari, the elderly Pontormo advises him not to view his painting alongside a real set of armor because his work will always look like a painting compared to the real object. Because it was considered arduous to transcribe glittering armor on canvas, the artist's skill in faithfully imitating it drew praise. In his letter to Alfonso d'Avalos, Pietro Aretino expresses his admiration for Titian's masterful depiction of the metallic luster that is so close to nature that it dazzles and blinds the spectator. In this context, tactile representation of the cool surface of the steel armor would have seemed a great opportunity for El Greco to display his abilities as a painter. By emphasizing the brilliant streaks of light bouncing off the breastplate, pauldrons, and rembrances, the painter enhances the effect of the armor, even at the cost of faithful transcription of the decorative motifs. El Greco's artistic experiments in the portrait of Anastagi can also be found in the representation of the dark crimson curtain behind the figure's upper body. Its unusual oval shape is at odds with the drapery typically drawn to one side in Italian Renaissance portraits. The painter appears to have taken careful measures to render the casual form of the curtain, which functions as an ingenious device for emphasizing the most important elements in the portrait, namely the sitter's face and armor. As can be seen in the Pentimento, El Greco moved the contour of the right edge of the drape upward in order to align it closer to the sitter's left forearm. Also, the X-radiograph shows that there was a wavy line between the figure's calves, which might indicate that the curtain was originally intended to hang lower. By shortening its length, El Greco achieves a tighter focus on the upper body of the sitter. This unconventional background not only sets off the face, which is rendered in finer strokes, but also encourages the viewer to compare the texture of the fabric with the metal in his work. Creating the illusion of different materials was of primary concern in Renaissance theory on the use of color. As Ludovico Dolce argued in his Dialogo della Pittura, I quote, "The main problem of coloring resides, then, in the imitation of flesh and involves diversifying the tones and achieving softness. Next, one needs to know how to imitate the color of draperies, silk, gold, and every kind of material so well that hardness or softness seems to be communicated to the greater or lesser degree which suits the quality of the material. One should know how to simulate the glint of armor," end quote. One of the prime examples of this can be found in Titian's portrait of Francesco Maria della Rovere, where the artist depicts the reflections of the crimson velvet on the helmet and the breastplate. Titian boasts his virtuosity in depicting different materials by representing the polished armor as both an object that has its own tactile quality and a surface that reflects the texture of the adjacent cloth. Taking into account the close affinity El Greco had with Venetian painters, the point of view shared by Aretino and Dolce would certainly have resonated with him. El Greco's departure from tradition in his portrait of Anastagi demonstrates his effort to differentiate his work from the established conventions of the military portrait. Exercising his artistic invention, the painter shows his unique approach to achieving a sense of lifelikeness quite distinct from that of Pulzone's meticulously executed portrait. El Greco's strategy was to emphasize Anastagi's military career and personal traits even more than his status. The sunburnt face and threads of gray hair, rendered with short, powerful brushstrokes, testify to his brilliant career on the battlefield rather than idealize his features to mask him with courtly elegance. The white hose accentuate the muscular calves that befit an experienced infantry officer. Anastagi's pose with his arms akimbo also conveys his character. This pose in Renaissance portraits typically reflects the self-confidence and composure of a male military figure. At the same time, the pose could also be interpreted as a sign of pride and ostentation. In the case of El Greco's Vincenzo Anastagi, the sense of self-possession is enhanced by the placement of the sitter's arms, which create a closed circular form around his torso. The X-radiograph shows that the painter altered the position of the sitter's left arm so that the elbow thrusts out, which animates his body with muscular tension. In the 16th century, this gesture becomes associated with aggressive masculine virtues, since the hand would be placed near a sword or a baton. Titian's Philip II exemplifies an earlier type of this gesture in a military portrait. The Spanish monarch grips the top of his scabbard as if to show his readiness to draw the rapier, reinforcing his martial prowess. Pulzone's portrait of Marcantonio Colonna almost exactly repeats this, except that his hand rests on the hilt rather than on the scabbard. It is also this formula that El Greco had in mind when he first set his brush to execute the work. The Pentimento of the scabbard indicates that the artist originally painted the rapier to point away from the sitter's body. The position of Anastagi's left hand also suggests that it had been intended to be placed on the hilt of the sword. As we see in the current version of the portrait, El Greco made an artful change. By shifting the orientation of the sword without altering the position of the hand, the painter directs the viewer's attention to the gilded hilt and to the scabbard of the rapier that runs parallel to the vambrance, inviting the spectator to see the weapon almost as the extension of the captain's mighty forearm. El Greco's intention was not only to honor Vincenzo Anastagi and evoke his military achievements, but also to advertise his own invention through the depiction of the armored sitter. It is evident, however, that he did not succeed in gaining favor from important personages through his innovative portrait as he left Rome for Spain the following year in 1576. If the worldly aspiration of the painter was frustrated in Rome, his experience in the Eternal City stoked his artistic ambition. Armor becomes one of El Greco's frequent motifs in his works executed in Spain. As can be seen in the Saint Martin and the Beggar and Saint Louis, King of France, with a page, the painter boasted his skill in representing steel garniture, whenever he depicted a military figure. One of his earliest works in Spain, The Disrobing of Christ, reflects his intensified interest in representing armor. On the right of the Christ figure, Saint Longinus stands in full armor, directing his gaze toward the spectator. His pose, excuse me. His pose, with arms akimbo, is reminiscent of the Anastagi portrait. Unlike the Vincenzo Anastagi, however, the smooth surface of the armor shows the reflections of the surrounding figures. Christ's red robe and the executioner's yellow and white garment appear distorted along the curve of the armor in a very convincing manner. This is more pronounced in the burial of the Count of Orgaz. In the bottom center of the composition, the protagonist, Gonzalo Ruiz de Toledo, is lowered to his coffin, dressed in full armor. His gorget reflects the face of St. Augustine, who supports his torso, and his breastplate mirrors the hand of a Knight of Santiago, along with the upper body and head of St. Stephen, who holds the corpse by the thighs. On Gonzalo's left pauldron arises a faint reflection of the image of St. James Major, which decorates St. Augustine's stole. El Greco's proud display of his skill in rendering the reflections on armor is indebted to the Venetian painting tradition that began with Giorgione. Vasari's Lives relates how Giorgione successfully showed all four sides of a naked figure in one painting to prove that painting is superior to sculpture. According to the text, Giorgione used the reflections of the body in a pool of water, a burnished cuirass, and a mirror. The episode is in fact a variation of Paolo Pino's account of Giorgione's painting, where the protagonist is not a naked man, but St. George in armor. It is uncertain whether Giorgione's painting ever existed. Nonetheless, El Greco acknowledges and repeats the Venetian painter's great achievement in his margin notes in his copy of Vasari's Lives. Girolamo Savoldo's portrait of a man in armor exemplifies Cinquecento artist's fascination with painting reflective surfaces that enable multiple views of an object, which proved useful in the Paragone debate concerning the superiority of painting to sculpture. El Greco was a proponent of the supremacy of painting because, in his view, it was the only form of art that could imitate reality in its totality. The representation of reflected images was one of the things that could be achieved only through painting. According to the Marginalia on Vitruvius, which El Greco wrote in Spain, reflections were the shadows that revealed the whole. El Greco was clearly a proud man who felt a keen sense of rivalry with the highly regarded artists of the time, especially portraitists. Notes he made in the margin of his copy of Vasari's Lives provide fascinating insight into the importance he attached to portraiture and his critical stance toward the Renaissance masters. Where Vasari praises Palma il Vecchio's self-portrait and compares the painter's mastery of painting to that of Leonardo and Michelangelo, El Greco writes that, and I quote, "Leonardo would never finish anything, and Michelangelo would not know how to begin, because Michelangelo did not know how to paint portraits. One cannot deny that he lacked and was impeded by such delicate qualities of portraiture." End quote. There is no documentary evidence of El Greco's opinion of his contemporary Pulzone. Nevertheless, a compelling case can be made for the catalytic effect on El Greco of the most popular portraitist in Rome. The magnificent verisimilitude of Pulzone's Jacopo Boncompagni, as well as the acclaim given to its creator, would have stimulated El Greco's ambition to surpass him in terms of worldly fame and artistic invention, which led to the creation of a most original portrait of a man in armor, Vincenzo Anastagi. When Henry Clay Frick saw El Greco's Vincenzo Anastagi at Knoedler's Gallery in London in 1913, he was probably drawn to its monumental quality. It would have seemed an appropriate addition to his collection as Frick began the construction of his neoclassical mansion on the corner of Fifth Avenue and East 70th Street in Manhattan. Henry Clay Frick was an industrialist who made a fortune through manufacturing coke in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Soon after his company became the most important provider of coke in the United States, Mr. Frick began a partnership with Andrew Carnegie and later became chairman of the Carnegie Steel Company. In 1905, he moved to New York, where he met the foremost collectors of art, such as William Vanderbilt and Henry and Louisine Havemeyer. It was in the same year when Frick bought his first El Greco, the St. Jerome. It was a bold move for Frick because El Greco's work only began to be appreciated in the United States. The friendly relationship with the Havemeyers stimulated his interest in collecting Spanish Old Master paintings. The Havemeyers were among the first American collectors to purchase an El Greco. In 1904, the couple bought the magnificent portrait of a cardinal, now in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It was perhaps this painting that sparked Frick's purchase of the St. Jerome. Although smaller in size compared to the portrait of a cardinal, the St. Jerome, then known as the portrait of Cardinal Gaspar de Quiroga, Archbishop of Toledo, asserts its powerful presence through the brilliant scarlet in bold brushwork and the highly individualized features of the figure. 4 years later, Frick acquired his second El Greco, the Purification of the Temple, painted around 1600. The Purification, which, with its highly religious content and expressive form, was an unusual choice for Frick, who was raised as a Protestant and favored paintings of secular subjects. As Susan Galassi has noted, the reason for his purchase of this work might be found in its prestigious provenance. It was undoubtedly an authentic work by El Greco, excuse me, and had been in the collection of Don Antonio de Bourbon, the son of King Louis Philippe of France. Frick was often driven by his desire to emulate powerful patrons of art in the practice of collecting. It seems that aristocratic association was an important factor for Frick when purchasing a painting, which reflected his aspirations to possess the old world prestige through his art collection. In this sense, El Greco's portrait of Anastagi suited very well to Frick's intentions. The work had belonged to Henry Labouchere, later Lord Taunton, a prominent British politician of the 19th century, and passed down to his grandson, who sold it to Kolnagi and Knoedler. Not only its provenance, but also its subject matter and format would have appealed to Frick. The self-confidence and self-composure displayed by the Knight of Malta in El Greco's portrait were also the virtues that Henry Clay Frick held in high esteem as a successful businessman. Although there is no written record of his thoughts about El Greco's work, a posthumous portrait of him gives us a visual hint. Commissioned by his daughter Helen Clay Frick and painted by Sir Gerald Kelly in 1925, the portrait of Mr. Frick in the West Gallery testifies to the New World entrepreneur's aspirations through the sitter's gesture that mimics those of King Philip IV of Spain, which you see on the left, and Vincenzo Anastagi, which you see on the right. In the magnificent art collection of a prominent industrialist, El Greco's Vincenzo Anastagi came to exemplify the noble ambitions of not only the sitter and the artist, but also the collector, immortalizing the three great men. Thank you.